Splendid. The microphones around the room, so if you stick up your hand and a microphone will find you. If everyone could just introduce themselves, I know we know who many of you are, but nonetheless that would help, and also wait for the microphones. But first question.
Hugh Morgan-Williams, Chairman of North East Access to Finance and also Chairman of the Northern Way. In my role as Chairman of North East Access to Finance, I think there is still considerable concern about banks' ability to fund small businesses out of the recession. And it's not just the availability of credit, it's the price at which that credit is being priced at. What measures do you think you can introduce to stimulate more competition in the banking industry, bearing in mind that the government's now a significant stakeholder in that business?
Okay. Firstly, I agree with you that especially as we move into recovery, it's essential that there is sufficient credit available, particularly to the SME sector. And what we've seen in the last year is that banks have actually lent more than they thought they were going to be, both in terms of the banks that are independent of government and in terms of those we've got shareholdings in. Although the figures overall have been masked slightly, and that there's been a very large repayment of people paying down their overdrafts, repaying their debts for perfectly obvious reasons. I am concerned to ensure that when we get the recovery, the credit is there, because particularly amongst the SME sector, it is bank credit that they depend upon. And we're working very closely both with the banks in which we've got shareholdings in, that's RBS and Lloyds for the most part, so far as SME lending is concerned, as well as the others, to try and ensure that we have an increase in the amount of lending being made available. You're right, obviously, that it's not just the availability of money that matters, it's the cost, the terms and conditions. I think there's a couple of things we can do to help there. One is, I think the banks need to be far more open and transparent about what exactly the terms and conditions are, so you can see what you're paying for and on what basis the charges are being made. I also think that there are special measures we can do, and RBS at the beginning of this year announced measures both in terms of making it easier to contact small and medium-sized enterprises, but also making additional funds particularly geared at particular forms of investment. On the broader competition point that you make, I think this is something that is pretty important. We've gone from a situation, say, 2 or 3 years ago, where basically there were, maybe 50 or 60, providers of mortgages. There was, maybe a dozen or so people active in the SME sector, to a situation now where there's about half a dozen major lenders in this country. Now, that compares in the States, for example, with 3,500. I want to make sure we get more competition, so I've made it very clear that as part of the state aid reconstruction rules, RBS and Lloyds do have to divest themselves of quite sizable parts of what they do. I want to make sure that we can use that opportunity to get new entrants into the system, because the more people you've got in the system, the greater the competition there is. Now, that applies as much to RBS, to Lloyds, as it does to Northern Rock, for example, which we've now split into two. And as I said before, we will take steps to return all these banks to the private sector when the conditions are right. I'm not going to rush into it because it's not in the taxpayers' interest to do that, but we need to get them back out. But above all, we need to make sure that the people who acquire them to be a new significant force in lending, and not simply acquire them and absorb them into the existing empire, so to speak.
What are your statistics telling you? Is credit to SMEs improving or not? Is there any evidence of that?
I think if you look at the statistics, the credit to the SMEs there's more of it. It's far better than we thought 12 months ago. The main body of complaints you get, though, tend to be in terms of the terms and conditions rather than whether or not you could get credit in the first place. Undoubtedly, you will get people who have got a business model that would have been fine 3 or 4 years ago, but is not fine now. And sometimes that can be quite difficult for industries. But basically, for the SME sector, at the moment, because the demand is just beginning to build up, there's more credit.
So, all of you are in business, you're getting the money you need from the banks.
I don't think anyone will say that.
It
is better than it was, is what I'm saying.
Okay, next question. Gentleman there.
John Bird, CE Electric UK. We're the electricity distribution business for this region. Another question on availability of finance, but at the larger end of the scale, Chancellor. Ofgem have recently said that we need to spend £200 billion in this country on renewing our electricity infrastructure and generation, largely to replace the stations that we'll be having to close over the next few years, and also to maintain the infrastructure. Across the world, that figure is going to be multiplied many times. How do we make sure that the UK is a favourable climate for investors to put their money in, so as we actually get the investment we need to replace our energy stock?
Well, I hope to say something more about this at the time of the budget, but you are right that we, and as well as most other major developed countries, are going to have to replace a lot of our energy over the next 20 years. In our case, our nuclear plant is ageing, a lot of our conventional plant is getting on. And especially when we want to do more in the low-carbon area, which can be quite expensive, and if you take offshore, for example, that has particular expense. This is going to represent quite a major burden on all governments. I think it's essential for two things. Firstly, you've got to recognise that this will involve a joint effort in terms of government and the energy producers. I believe that the Ofgem work on the way in which the market has worked in the past few years is going to provide quite a valuable indicator as to what changes we might make in the future. But I think that the main thing that I want to try and do is to firstly provide certainty, because investors want to know that you are going to replace the stock. And here, the changes we've made to the planning laws are absolutely essential in my view. If you repeal them, if you get rid of them, it will take you years even to get planning permission for something before you start to build them. But also, I want to make it easier for investors, particularly the institutional investors, to invest in energy. Now, that's something that we're looking at. We're looking at ways in which you would attract the institutional investors in. Many of them are looking for long-term income streams, and we need to match up that demand on their side with the obvious concerns government has in relation to borrowing, in relation to how you finance these things. But to my mind, you're not going to be able to replace the energy we need without both the public and private sector working together. But the task is urgent, and as I say, I'll have something more to say about that in the budget time.